The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a soft hiss. Ambassador Lisa Morgan walked through them for what she knew would be the last time. Her black diplomatic uniform bore the Earth insignia on her shoulder, a small blue planet that seemed so insignificant in this vast hall filled with alien beings who had spent 3 decades making her people's lives miserable. The chamber stretched out before her like a coliseum, designed by architects who understood intimidation. Curved tiers of seats rose up on all sides, each occupied by representatives of species that had decided humanity was a problem to be managed rather than partners to be respected. At the center of it all sat the High Council bench, where the real power brokers held court. Lisa had walked this path hundreds of times over the past 8 years as Earth's chief diplomatic representative. She had sat through countless sessions where aliens debated humanity's fate as if humans were children who needed constant supervision. She had smiled politely while they imposed trade restrictions that starved entire colonies. She had nodded respectfully while they declared human settlements illegal and ordered evacuations. She had even maintained her composure when they suggested that human aggression was a genetic flaw that needed correction. But today was different. Today they had finally crossed the line that could never be uncrossed. The chamber fell silent as she reached the speaking platform at the center of the floor. Above her, the massive viewing screen displayed the Galactic Council's official seal, a symbol that had once represented hope for humanity's place among the stars. Now it just reminded her of 30 years of systematic humiliation. Council leader Vextar of the Zolani Empire leaned forward in his high seat. His scaled face twisted into what passed for a smile among his species, revealing rows of sharp teeth that had evolved for tearing flesh. The Zolani had been the driving force behind most of the anti-human legislation, using their influence to turn other species against Earth's colonies. Ambassador Morgan, Vextar said, his voice carrying the artificial translation that made all council proceedings sound cold and mechanical. I trust you have reviewed our latest resolution regarding the human problem. Lisa reached into her jacket and pulled out a datapad containing the document that had been delivered to her quarters 3 hours ago. She had read it 17 times, hoping she had misunderstood something. But the words were clear enough that even the Council's usual diplomatic doublespeak couldn't hide their meaning. Resolution 847B, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. I have indeed reviewed it. The document contained 3 demands that the Council expected humanity to fulfill within 6 months. The first was the complete surrender of all human military vessels to Council custody. The second was the immediate evacuation of 12 human colony worlds that the Council had decided were too strategically located for humanity to keep. The third was the most insulting of all: mandatory genetic modification of all human citizens to reduce what the Council called inherent aggressive tendencies. Excellent, Vextar said. Then you understand that these measures are necessary for galactic peace. Humanity has proven time and again that your species cannot be trusted with unrestricted freedom. Your expansion has been too rapid, your military too large, your independence too threatening to the established order. Lisa looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who had spent decades convincing themselves that humanity was the problem. The Karathi delegation sat in their environmental suits, their insectoid features hidden behind reflective visors. They had supported every anti-human measure because humans reminded them too much of the predators that had once hunted their ancestors. The Velthan representatives, with their pale blue skin and oversized eyes, had voted against human interests because their pacifist culture couldn't understand why any species would maintain a military at all. Then there were the dozen smaller species that simply went along with whatever the Zolani wanted, either out of fear or because they benefited from the trade advantages that came with supporting the dominant power. They had watched humanity be slowly strangled by regulations and restrictions, and they had done nothing because it wasn't their problem. Ambassador, Vextar continued, your silence is noted. I trust this means humanity will comply with our reasonable demands. Lisa felt something inside her snap. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was more like the sound a bridge makes just before it collapses, that moment when structural integrity finally gives way under too much pressure. She had spent 8 years trying to find compromise, trying to work within the system, trying to prove that humans could be reasonable partners in galactic civilization, but reasonable partners didn't get treated like humanity had been treated. Reasonable partners got respect. They got fair hearings. They got the assumption that their concerns mattered and their sovereignty meant something. Instead, humanity had gotten 30 years of death by 1,000 cuts. Trade routes closed for safety concerns. Mining rights revoked for environmental protection. Colonial charters canceled for territorial optimization. And through it all, human diplomats had smiled and negotiated, and tried to find middle ground with people who saw compromise as weakness. Lisa reached up and unpinned the diplomatic insignia from her uniform collar. The small golden symbol represented her authority to speak for Earth and all its colonies, granted to her by the United Nations and recognized by the Galactic Council. It was the physical representation of humanity's membership in galactic civilization. She held it up so everyone in the chamber could see it clearly. The light caught the polished metal and sent tiny reflections dancing across the walls. Several alien delegates leaned forward, uncertain what they were witnessing. For 30 years, Lisa said, her voice steady and clear, humanity has tried to work within this system. We have accepted your restrictions, we have complied with your regulations, we have submitted to your inspections. We have allowed you to treat us like dangerous children who needed constant supervision. She opened her hand and let the insignia fall to the floor. It hit the polished surface with a small metallic ping that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. We are done, she said. Humanity formally withdraws from all galactic treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic protocols. We reject the authority of this council and any claim you might have to govern human affairs. We will no longer negotiate, compromise, or explain ourselves to this body. The chamber erupted. Delegates leaped to their feet, shouting in a dozen different languages. Translation systems overloaded, trying to keep up with the chaos. Vextar pounded his gavel, demanding order, but his voice was lost in the noise. Lisa continued speaking, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade. Any attempt to enforce your will upon human territory, any military action against human colonies, any interference with human sovereignty will be considered an act of war. You have pushed us too far, and we refuse to be pushed any further. She turned and walked toward the exit, her security detail falling in behind her. Behind her, the shouting grew louder. She heard Vextar screaming something about human arrogance and the need for immediate military action. Other voices demanded her arrest, her detention, her trial for diplomatic violations, but Lisa didn't look back. She had delivered the message. She came to deliver. Humanity was done talking. As the chamber doors closed behind her, she allowed herself a small smile. They thought they had been dealing with sheep. They were about to discover they had been negotiating with wolves who had simply chosen to be polite. 6 months had passed since Ambassador Lisa Morgan walked out of the Galactic Council chambers, and the silence from human space had become deafening. Trade ships that approached human borders found themselves facing polite but firm rejections. Diplomatic envoys sent urgent messages that went unanswered. Intelligence networks that had operated freely in human territory for decades suddenly found their contacts gone and their information sources dried up. Admiral Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching through the massive viewport as construction ships worked around the clock on humanity's newest orbital shipyard. The facility hung in space above Mars like a metal spider, its arms extending in all directions as automated systems assembled the framework for vessels that would make the galaxy tremble. This was the third such shipyard to come online in the past 4 months. Hidden facilities scattered throughout human space were working at maximum capacity, their existence unknown to the aliens who still believed they understood human capabilities. For 30 years, humanity had been building ships. to Council specifications following guidelines that limited size, weaponry, and operational range. Those guidelines no longer applied. "Admiral," came a voice from behind him. Jake turned to see Captain Ben Rogers approaching with a datapad in his hand. Ben had been overseeing the construction projects personally, spending weeks at each facility to ensure they met the new requirements. His face showed the exhaustion that came from months of 18-hour workdays, but his eyes held the same fierce determination that had spread through human space like wildfire. "Status report," Jake said, taking the pad and scrolling through. The numbers, what he saw made him smile grimly. Production was ahead of schedule on all fronts. "The shipyards are performing beyond expectations," Ben said. "We're launching 2 new vessels every week now, and that rate will double once the facilities at Europa and Titan come online. The new designs are testing perfectly in simulation." The new designs were something special. For decades, human engineers had been forced to work within Council restrictions that limited their creativity and capability. Ships had to meet certain size requirements, carry specific types of non-aggressive weaponry, and include monitoring systems that allowed Council inspectors to track their movements. Those days were over. The vessels rolling out of human shipyards now were purpose-built for war. They were smaller than traditional Council warships, but infinitely more maneuverable. Their hulls incorporated stealth technology that would make them nearly invisible to alien sensors. Their weapon systems used innovations that had been banned under Council regulations, designs that could punch through alien shields like paper. "What about the training programs?" Jake asked, moving to his command chair and pulling up fleet deployment charts. Red dots scattered across human space showed the locations of ships and bases that the Council had never known existed. "Colonel, Rick Stone reports that all combat units are ready for deployment," Ben said. "The new tactics are being implemented fleet-wide. Every ship captain has been trained in the specific weaknesses of Council member species. That training had been 30 years in the making." While human diplomats smiled and made nice at Council meetings, human military observers had been taking careful notes. They studied alien ship designs, recorded reaction times, analyzed communication patterns, and documented everything from weapon recharge rates to crew rotation schedules. The aliens had been so confident in their superiority that they never bothered to hide their vulnerabilities. Jake switched his display to show intelligence reports from Dr. Helen Carter's research division. Helen had been working with a team of scientists to develop weapons and tactics specifically designed to exploit what humans had learned about alien physiology and technology. Her work would have horrified the Council if they had known about it, but they had been too busy making speeches about human aggression to pay attention to human ingenuity. "The Council is getting nervous," Ben said, settling into the chair beside Jake. "Our intelligence networks report increased chatter about the human situation. Some members are pushing for direct military action." "Let them come," Jake said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that would have made a wise alien very afraid. "We've been preparing for this moment for months. Every scenario has been war-gamed. Every contingency has been planned." The truth was that humanity had been preparing for this moment for much longer than months. Even while their diplomats negotiated and compromised, human military planners had been quietly developing strategies for the day when diplomacy failed. They had studied every major conflict in galactic history, analyzed every successful military campaign, and learned from every species that had ever stood up to Council authority. Most of those species were extinct now, but they had left lessons behind for anyone smart enough to learn from them. Jake's communicator chimed, and he touched the control to accept an incoming transmission from Earth. President Kate Bennett's face appeared on the screen, looking tired but determined. She had been dealing with the political fallout from humanity's withdrawal from the Council, managing panicked colonial governors and worried citizens who feared what would come next. "Admiral," she said, "I need a status update. The Council is demanding answers, and some of our own people are getting scared." "Tell them not to worry," Jake replied. "We knew this would happen when Ambassador Morgan delivered our message." The Council was never going to accept human independence peacefully. They've spent too many years treating us like children to suddenly start respecting us as equals. Kate nodded. She had been part of the secret planning committee that had authorized the military build-up months before the diplomatic withdrawal. The decision hadn't been made lightly, but it had been made with full knowledge of what it would lead to. "How long do we have?" she asked. Jake looked at his tactical displays, where tracking sensors showed the movement of Council fleets throughout the galaxy. Their patterns were becoming more aggressive, more focused on human space. Intelligence. Reports suggested that several major powers were already mobilizing their militaries. "Maybe a few more weeks," he said. "They're still trying to figure out how to respond to something they never expected. But eventually they'll decide that force is the only language we understand. And when they do?" Jake smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "When they do, they're going to learn why Earth's apex predators were never the biggest or strongest creatures on the planet. They were the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most dangerous when cornered." The transmission ended, and Jake returned, his attention to the displays showing human military strength. The numbers were impressive, but numbers alone wouldn't win the coming war. What would win it was something the Council had never bothered to understand about humanity. They were at their most dangerous when they stopped talking and started acting. For 30 years, humans had been the galaxy's diplomats, always willing to negotiate, always ready to compromise. The aliens had mistaken this for weakness, assuming that a species so eager to avoid conflict must be incapable of winning one. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been. The silence from human space wasn't surrender. It was the calm before the storm. The Zilani fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system like predators arriving at a watering hole. 60 warships arranged themselves in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the polished metal that marked them as vessels of the Galactic Council's most powerful military force. At their head flew the ZS Dominator, flagship of Commodore Thelmira, a veteran of a dozen campaigns against species that had dared to challenge Council authority. Thelmira stood on her bridge, studying the sensor readings that showed human space spread out before her fleet. She had expected to find scattered defensive positions and panicked civilian evacuations. Instead, her sensors detected what appeared to be normal commercial traffic and the quiet operation of human colonies, going about their daily business. "Commodore," her sensor officer reported, "I'm detecting 20 human vessels approaching our position. They appear to be military ships, but their design doesn't match any configuration in our databases." Thelmira's scaled lips pulled back in what her species considered a smile. 20 ships against 60 was exactly the kind of hopeless gesture she had come to expect from species that overestimated their own capabilities. The humans were apparently going to make this easy for her. "Signal the fleet to maintain formation," she ordered. "Let them come. When they see the size of our force, they'll realize the futility of resistance and surrender without a fight." The human ships approached at a steady pace, their sleek hulls reflecting the light of Sol's star. They moved with a precision that impressed even Thelmira's experienced officers, maintaining perfect spacing and formation. Even as they accelerated into what should have been a hopeless battle, at the center of the human formation flew a vessel that seemed somehow different from the others. Its hull bore markings that identified it as the UES Independence, and its communication arrays were already broadcasting on standard diplomatic frequencies. "Incoming transmission from the human fleet," the communications officer announced. "Audio and visual." "Put it through," Thelmira said, settling back in her command chair to enjoy what she expected would be a plea for mercy. The main screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of the human vessel. At its center stood a woman in a crisp military uniform, her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation style that somehow managed to look both professional and defiant. Her blue eyes held no trace of fear as she looked directly at the camera. "I am Captain Amy Foster of the United Earthship Independence," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You have entered human sovereign space without permission or invitation. You have exactly 1 hour to withdraw your fleet beyond our territorial boundaries or you will be destroyed. This is your only warning." The transmission ended, leaving Thelmira staring at a blank screen. Around her, the bridge crew exchanged glances of disbelief. In all her years of military service, she had never received such a direct threat from a force so obviously outnumbered. "Did they seriously just threaten us?" her tactical officer asked, his voice carrying the incredulous tone that came with witnessing something completely outside normal experience. Thelmira began to laugh, a harsh sound that filled the bridge with its mockery. "Apparently they did? 20 ships threatening 60, as if numbers meant nothing. As if technological superiority counted for nothing. As if 3 centuries of Zolani military dominance could be dismissed by human arrogance." She stood and walked to the main display, where tactical readouts showed the relative positions of both fleets. The human ships had stopped their advance and now hung motionless in space as if waiting for her response. Their weapon systems showed as powered but not locked onto targets, suggesting they were serious about giving her the promised hour to withdraw. "Open a channel to all ships," she ordered. "This is Commodore Thelmira to all vessels. The humans have apparently decided to resist our peaceful mission with violence. When the hour expires, we will demonstrate why the Galactic Council's authority is not to be questioned." The next 58 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Thelmira used the time to study her tactical displays and plan the coming battle. Her ships held every possible advantage: superior numbers, proven weapon systems, experienced crews, and the backing of the most powerful military alliance in the galaxy. The humans had courage and desperation, but those had never been enough to overcome such overwhelming odds. As the final minutes ticked away, she found herself almost admiring the human captain's composure. Most species would have spent the time begging for mercy or trying to negotiate some face-saving retreat. Instead, the human ships maintained their positions in perfect silence, as if they were confident in their ability to back up their threats. "Time expires in 30 seconds, her tactical officer announced. "All ships prepare to engage," Thelmira ordered. "Target their command vessel first. Once their leadership is eliminated, the rest will surrender quickly enough." 10 seconds. TO engagement. Fire. The Zolani fleet opened fire simultaneously, 60 ships unleashing their weapons at the human formation. Plasma bolts and energy beams filled the space between the fleets, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so deadly, but something went wrong immediately. The human ships didn't die as they were supposed to. Instead, they moved with a speed and agility that Thelmira's sensors had difficulty tracking. Their hulls absorbed or deflected attacks that should have vaporized them instantly, and their return fire struck with a precision that seemed impossible. "Report," she shouted over the alarms that had begun blaring throughout her ship. "The humans are using some kind of adaptive shielding," her science officer called out. "Our weapons are having minimal effect. And their targeting systems are incredibly accurate. They're hitting our weak points with every shot." Thelmira watched in growing horror as her tactical display showed Zolani ships disappearing from the screen. Not just damaged or disabled, but completely destroyed. The humans were fighting with a cold efficiency that turned what should have been a one-sided battle into a massacre. "How is this possible?" she whispered, watching another of her vessels explode under human fire. Captain Foster's voice suddenly filled her bridge, transmitted on all frequencies. "You were warned. This is what happens when you push humans too far." The human ships moved through the Zolani formation like sharks among minnows, their weapons finding targets with deadly accuracy while their enhanced hulls shrugged off return fire. They fought with a coordination that spoke of months of training and preparation, each vessel knowing exactly where the others would be and what they would do. Within 30 minutes, 47 Zolani ships had been destroyed. The survivors, including Thelmira's flagship, found themselves surrounded by human vessels that could have finished them off but instead held their fire. "All Zolani vessels?" Captain Foster's voice came over the communications system. "You will withdraw immediately from human space. If you ever return, you will not receive another warning." Thelmira looked around her damaged bridge at the faces of crew members who had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. Her fleet, the pride of the Zilani Empire, had been shattered by a force they had dismissed as insignificant. "Signal retreat," she ordered, her voice hollow with defeat. "All ships withdraw to the designated rally point." As the surviving Zilani vessels limped away from the battle zone, Thelmira realized that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. The humans weren't just refusing to negotiate anymore. They were demonstrating that they didn't need to. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened just 12 hours after the destruction of Commodore Thelmira's fleet. The great chamber that had once echoed with confident speeches about human weakness now buzzed with panicked whispers and fearful glances. Council leader Vexstar stood at the central podium, his scaled hands gripping the edges so tightly that his claws left gouges in the metal. "The human threat has escalated beyond all acceptable parameters," he announced to the assembled delegates. "Their unprovoked attack on our peacekeeping force represents an act of war against the entire galactic community. We have no choice but to respond with overwhelming force." The vote was swift and unanimous. Every council member species pledged their military forces to the largest fleet in galactic history. 317 warships from 6 different civilizations would converge on human space within the week. Admiral Korthex of the Zilani Empire would command the combined fleet, bringing with him a reputation for ruthless efficiency that had crushed 17 different rebellions over the past century. But while the Council prepared for war, humanity was already fighting it. Admiral Jake Harrison stood in the command center buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, watching as tactical displays showed human forces striking simultaneously across 12 different star systems. The operation had been planned for months, waiting only for the Council to make the first aggressive move that would justify everything that followed. "Protocol Nemesis is now active," he announced to the room full of officers who had spent their careers preparing for this moment. "All strike teams are to proceed to their designated targets. Rules of engagement are clear. Destroy all military infrastructure, all government facilities, and all symbols of Council authority. Civilian casualties are to be avoided, but military objectives take priority." Captain Steve Walsh led the assault on the Zilani homeworld's orbital stations. His task force of 30 ships emerged from hyperspace above Zealand Prime to find a world that had never known the fear of attack. And the massive orbital platforms that surrounded the planet like metal moons had been built for commerce and administration, not defense. They died quickly under concentrated human fire. "This is Captain Walsh to all Zilani forces," he broadcast as his ships systematically destroyed every piece of military hardware in orbit. "Your government has declared war on humanity. These installations are legitimate military targets. Any vessel that attempts to interfere will be destroyed without warning." The Zilani home fleet tried to respond, but their ships had been designed for fighting inferior opponents using outdated tactics. Human vessels danced around them with impossible agility, their weapons cutting through Zilani shields as if they weren't there. Within 6 hours, the orbital defenses that had protected Zealand Prime for 3 centuries were nothing but debris. Meanwhile, Commander Lisa Park's fleet was busy turning the primary Zilani shipyards into scrap metal, the massive industrial complexes that had produced the warships that enforced council will throughout the galaxy burned under human attack. Decades of military production capability disappeared in a single day, along with hundreds of vessels that would never threaten human colonies. "Target destroyed," Lisa reported as another shipyard exploded in a ball of superheated gas. Moving to secondary objectives. Enemy response is minimal and disorganized. On the surface of Council member worlds, Major Tony Clark's ground forces were demonstrating that human infantry was just as effective as human spacecraft. His soldiers moved through government complexes with the same cold efficiency their ships showed in space, destroying records, capturing officials, and dismantling the administrative structure that had oppressed smaller species for generations. The ground assault on the Korathi Council archives was typical of the operation's scope. Tony's troops breached the supposedly impregnable facility in under an hour, their powered armor and advanced weapons making short work of alien security forces. But instead of simply destroying everything, they carefully preserved certain documents while eliminating others. "Sir," one of his sergeants reported, "we found the classified files on Council manipulation of trade agreements. Should we download them for Dr. Lee's intelligence division?" "Download everything," Tony ordered. "The galaxy is going to learn exactly how corrupt this system really was." Dr. Patricia Lee's intelligence teams were already broadcasting evidence of Council crimes across every communication network in known space. Species that had suffered under Council rule for centuries suddenly had proof that their oppression hadn't been legal or necessary. It had been calculated exploitation designed to benefit the powerful at the expense of everyone else. The broadcasts showed secret agreements between Council members to fix trade prices, evidence of military threats used to coerce smaller species into unfavorable treaties, and documentation of the systematic suppression of technological advancement among species that might challenge Council authority. Most damaging of all were the recordings of Council sessions where leaders openly discussed treating other species as resources to be managed rather than equals to be respected. Commander Paul Wright led the diplomatic missions to species that had been kept weak and dependent by Council policies. His ships arrived at their worlds not as conquerors but as liberators, offering genuine partnership to civilizations that had forgotten what freedom looked like. "The Council told you that humans were dangerous," Paul said during a broadcast to the Therian people, whose peaceful nature had made them easy targets for Council exploitation. "They were right. We are dangerous to bullies, to tyrants, and to anyone who thinks they can treat other beings as property. But we offer something the Council never did, the choice to stand as equals rather than kneel as subjects." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Species after species announced their withdrawal from Council authority. Some joined humanity's growing alliance immediately, while others simply declared independence and dared the weakened Council to try stopping them. The Council's response was predictable but futile. Admiral Korthvek's massive fleet finally reached human space, only to find that the war was already over. His ships faced not the desperate defense of a cornered species, but the confident strength of a civilization that had already proven its point. Human vessels met his fleet at the edge of the Sol system, outnumbered but no longer outgunned. "This is Admiral Harrison to the Council fleet," came the transmission from the lead human vessel. "You have entered sovereign human territory during an active state of war. You will withdraw immediately or face the consequences of your actions." Korthvex looked at his tactical displays, where the numbers told a story he didn't want to believe. His 300 ships faced fewer than 60 human vessels, but those vessels had already demonstrated capabilities that defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. Around him, his bridge crew waited for orders that he found himself reluctant to give. "Admiral," his tactical officer said quietly, "our intelligence reports indicate that human forces have successfully neutralized Council military assets across 12 star systems. Our supply lines, our shipyards, our administrative centers, they're all gone." Korthvex realized with growing horror that he wasn't commanding a war fleet anymore. He was leading a group of ships with nowhere to return to, serving a government that no longer controlled the territory it claimed to rule. The humans hadn't just refused to negotiate. They had made negotiation irrelevant by demonstrating that the Council's authority was an illusion that could be shattered by anyone willing to call their bluff, the great fleet that was supposed to crush human resistance found itself facing a choice: attack and be destroyed, or withdraw and acknowledge that the old order was dead. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same. Admiral Korthvex stared at the tactical display showing 60 human ships, facing his fleet of 300 vessels, and knew that numbers no longer mattered. Behind him, his communication officers reported the same devastating news from across the galaxy. Council authority was collapsing everywhere at once. Species that had submitted to their rule for centuries were declaring independence. Military bases that had enforced Council law for generations lay in ruins. The carefully constructed system of galactic governance was falling apart like a house built on sand. "Admiral," his aide whispered, "the Therian government has just announced their withdrawal from all Council treaties. The Maltese colonies are refusing to recognize Council jurisdiction. Even some of our own member species are questioning whether continued resistance serves any purpose." Korthvex closed his eyes and felt the weight of 3 centuries of Zelani dominance settling on his shoulders. His species had built their empire on the belief that superior technology and overwhelming force could solve any problem. They had never encountered an enemy that could match their capabilities, while possessing something they lacked: the absolute conviction that came from fighting for freedom, rather than control. The human fleet maintained its position at the edge of human space, neither advancing nor retreating. Their ships hung in the void like patient predators, waiting to see whether the Council fleet would choose wisdom or destruction. The message was clear: humanity would defend itself if attacked, but they weren't interested in conquest for its own sake. "Admiral," Jake Harrison's voice cut through the tense silence on an open communication channel that reached every ship in both fleets. "Admiral Korthvex, I'm transmitting a message to the galaxy on all frequencies. I suggest you listen carefully." The transmission began broadcasting across every inhabited world in known space, carrying words that would reshape the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. Jake stood on the bridge of his flagship with Earth visible through the viewports behind him, a blue marble that had produced the species now holding the galaxy's attention. "People of the galaxy," he began, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who had just proven his point with devastating efficiency. For 30 years, humanity tried to work within the system established by the Galactic Council. We accepted restrictions on our expansion, limitations on our technology, and interference in our internal affairs because we believed that cooperation was possible. The transmission showed images of human colonies abandoned under Council pressure, of trade routes closed by alien bureaucrats, of diplomatic sessions where human concerns were dismissed without consideration. It painted a picture of systematic oppression disguised as galactic law. "We were wrong," Jake continued. "The Council was never interested in cooperation. They wanted submission. They saw our willingness to negotiate as weakness and our desire for peace as proof that we could be pushed around indefinitely. They forgot that choosing not to fight is different from being unable to fight." Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched as the transmission showed footage from the recent conflicts. Human ships moving with impossible precision, alien military installations crumbling under coordinated attack, and species after species breaking free from the chains that had bound them for generations. "Humanity seeks no empire," Jake said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "We have no desire to rule over other species or to impose our will on civilizations that wish to remain independent. But we will never again submit to those who mistake kindness for weakness or patience for cowardice." On Zealand Prime, the surviving members of the Council leadership watched the transmission from emergency bunkers deep underground. Their orbital platforms were gone, their fleets were scattered, and their authority was evaporating as quickly as their military power. Council leader Vexstar, who had spent decades believing that alien superiority was a natural law, found himself facing the collapse of everything he had worked to build. "The Terran Accords will replace the failed system of Council governance," Jake announced. "Any species that wishes to join our alliance may do so as an equal partner. We offer fair trade, mutual defense, and respect for sovereignty. What we will not offer is submission to the will of those who see cooperation as a sign of weakness." President Kate Bennett appeared on the transmission, standing in the newly constructed assembly hall where representatives from dozens of species were already gathering. Unlike the old Council chambers designed to intimidate, this space emphasized equality and open communication. "The galaxy stands at a crossroads," she said. "You can choose to embrace a future based on mutual respect and voluntary cooperation, or you can cling to the old system of domination and control. But you cannot choose both." Captain Ben Rogers led the first joint exploration mission launched under the new Accords. his ships accompanied by vessels from 6 different species that had thrown off Council rule. Their destination was the unexplored regions beyond the galactic rim, where new worlds waited for civilizations brave enough to work together rather than against each other. "This is how humanity explores," Ben announced as his mixed fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. "Not as conquerors seeking to claim territory, but as partners seeking to expand the boundaries of knowledge for everyone's benefit." The old council species faced a choice that would define their future. Some, like the Korathi, chose to adapt to the new reality and applied for membership in the Terran Accords. Others, particularly the Zelani leadership, retreated into isolation and internal conflict as their empire fragmented under the weight of its own contradictions. Admiral Korthvek stood on his bridge and felt the tide of history washing over him. His fleet still outnumbered the human forces facing them, but numbers meant nothing when the foundation of authority had crumbled. His own crew members were questioning the wisdom of continuing a fight that served no purpose beyond preserving the pride of leaders who had already lost everything that mattered. "Signal the fleet," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of acknowledging defeat. "All ships will withdraw from human space and return to their home systems. The war is over." As the massive Council fleet turned and jumped to hyperspace, Admiral Harrison watched them go with something that might have been pity. They had come to crush human resistance and instead had witnessed the birth of a new galactic order, based on principles their species had forgotten. That true strength came from inspiring others to stand with you rather than forcing them to kneel before you. Dr. Helen Carter's research teams began sharing their technological advances with Alliance members, proving that human innovation worked better when it served everyone's interests rather than just human needs. The weapons technology that had shattered Council fleets was adapted for peaceful purposes, turning tools of destruction into instruments of exploration and discovery. The galaxy learned a lesson that would echo through the centuries. Humanity was most dangerous not when they were angry, but when they simply refused to be pushed around anymore. They had transformed galactic civilization not through conquest, but through the simple act of standing up and saying no to injustice. The old order was dead, and in its place rose something better, a galaxy where cooperation was chosen rather than forced, where strength protected the weak rather than exploiting them, and where the future belonged to those brave enough to reach for it together.